After years of this.
Well, companies in one of this country's burgeoning industries are at risk of fleeing to Australia to make the most of new tax incentives.
The video game industry has exploded into an entertainment economy worth $200 billion. Yet, despite Kiwi developers competing on the world stage, the sector has largely been ignored by successive governments.
We are seeing poaching from overseas studios and Australian studios, and they're armed with great big wads of cash.
It's all about Aotearoa. And the last thing that we really want is for our Māori game to not be developed in Aotearoa.
If we could see improvements to the local investment scene, to government support, then we'll be able to accelerate.
The video game industry has been crying out for help, and the last government finally said yes.
In Thursday's budget, the government announced a 20% rebate for New Zealand-based digital game developers. Jenny Anderson is back with her portai as the Minister for Digital Communications now. Why should video game developers get a 20% rebate?
We want to keep them here in New Zealand and make the most of what it offers our economy.
And this government has followed suit.
Well, there is good news for New Zealand's gaming sector. National will continue the tax rebate scheme brought in under Labour, despite David Seymour blasting it as corporate welfare.
Last week, the first recipients of the games development sector rebates, 32 gaming studios in all, were announced. But some concerns remain.
It's a great signal to other private sectors, isn't it? If you lobby the government, you can get a tax rebate.
Kia ora, I'm Tom Kitchen, and today on The Detail, the ins and outs of this rebate. And why does gaming, the most profitable sector of entertainment, need money from the government? I spoke with Finn Hogan and Zoe Hobson.
I'm Finn Hogan. I'm currently the tech reporter for NewsHub. I kind of just provide the nerdy content for whatever medium I can get it on, but recently have made that a bit more formalised and have full-time covered the tech sector.
And the gaming sector's a part of that kind of nerdy space?
Exactly. As a lifelong nerd, I've been playing video games my entire life, and I always felt like it, despite its immense sort of business power and economic benefit, it never really got the cultural cut-through that I thought it deserved because, it's bigger than music and movies put together. It's the dominant form of entertainment on the planet.
Kia ora, my name is Zoe Hobson. I'm the CEO at Runaway Play. And Runaway Play is a games developer and publisher based in Otipoti, Dunedin.
Tell me a bit about your Runaway Play first off. What kind of games do you have? Who plays them?
Yeah, so we specialise in mobile games and we prioritise making games that players can play for years and years. Our main audience is adult women, so we're making casual games for mobile. Probably the easiest example that I tend to give people is if you think about like the Candy Crush audience. We make games for a similar demographic, but our games are a bit more wholesome and nature-based. So one of our oldest games is called Flutter Butterfly Sanctuary.
How many staff do you have?
We have 40 staff, which has grown considerably from when I started. When I started in 2015 is when I joined the company, and we were 8 back then.
Where are most of your customers? Are they mostly based here in New Zealand or a bit further afield? No, okay.
No, 70% of our audience are adult women in the US.
Right, okay, quite significant, yeah. Do you know how many people play your games roughly?
We've had over 20 million downloads of our games and consistently have hundreds of thousands of people playing them every single month.
I think the New Zealand sector's done very well for itself, in part riding the kind of global gains that the sector has seen across the last decade. And specifically, New Zealand has fostered some amazing talent and produced some incredible games. I think Grinding Gear Games out in Henderson, who produced Path of Exile.
Exile was meant to be my death sentence. Instead, it was my rebirth.
That was started by a couple of guys from AUT, scaled up to being a pretty major developer, and then sold to Tencent, which is a giant Chinese entertainment conglomerate, for I think over $200 million. But that's just one example. I think the industry has seen about 10% revenue growth year on year. I think that doubled between 2017 and 2020. It's on track to be $1 billion export by next year. So yeah, it's done incredibly well. And I can imagine people hearing that might think, well, if it's doing that well, can't it just continue to do that well? Why do we need government subsidies? But I do think there are good reasons for them.
Well, let's talk about that. So the growth has been lagging for several years, right? And there have been other countries that are doing way better in terms of the gaming sector, in terms of growth. So that's generally because the government's coming to help out, yeah?
I don't think it's so much a case of our industry's really lagging behind the rest of the world and there are other countries who are doing exceptionally better than us. The only thing I'd say on that is somewhere like Finland, who really took this seriously a long time ago, and they're a roughly equivalent size to New Zealand population-wise, but they've been investing in the game sector for decades, and their sector's worth over about $5 billion now.
Finland has had some pretty big games, like Angry Birds. Who hasn't played Angry Birds?
Exactly, yes.
What other games has Finland produced that we might...
Well, I think Max Payne, for nerds in the audience, there's a Finnish developer there, Remedy, which has produced recently Alan Wake 2, which was nominated for Game of the Year.
I brought you the Heart Witch. Show me the terror.
They've achieved both that really sort of hugely commercially and critically successful games, but also those sort of more artistic, sort of stranger games like Alan Wake. So Finland has just got a really vibrant gaming economy, and I do think it's an easy target for us to aim at. It does go to show what kind of growth you can get from that investment. I do think that the rest of the world has taken this more seriously recently, and that's one of the reasons that there was a bit of pressure on government. I think the Australian example particularly has been huge. They've brought in some 40% tax rebates, so 40% on the dollar back, which has been enormous.
The announcement of the rebate really straps a rocket to an industry that was already growing from strength to strength. A lot of international studios have been looking around, looking to find that next wave of talent, and they're just looking for that catalyst to unlock the opportunity here in Australia.
To compete with that, New Zealand really had to do something, or they were really going to start facing some brain drain.
And why is the return on investment so huge? If the government puts in some money, why does it get back and why?
Well, I think when you look at the return on investment for gaming, it's because very little money in can lead to enormous profit out, right? Because what you need to make a video game is essentially a couple of developers and an interconnection and some hardware. But the ceiling on the kind of profit that you can produce off the back of that is absolutely enormous. I mean, a great example here would be Black Salt Games in Christchurch. There's 4 people full-time who work there. They made a game called Dredge, sold over 1.5 million copies in the past 12 months. I was speaking to them for a story and they told me that that's a 10 times return on investment just in the first year.
It's been a bit of a funny few years in the gaming market. Probably the best way to describe where we're at right now is if we step back a couple of years. The New Zealand gaming industry had been growing really strongly with very little or not really, any significant support. I think if we look back a few years, it was growing at like an average of 26% year on year. And we'd had growth of like 47% in 2022. So
that's just revenue, is it? Or...
Yeah, revenue growth. So that's like very significant growth for an industry and, high value digital exports as well. Then what we started to see a few years ago is that a lot of other countries had been offering rebates and support for the games industries. And so we started seeing a shift. Growth in New Zealand started to slow. Companies started to see staff moving overseas, and we started to lose some of our highly experienced staff, which is very challenging and has a really big impact on the industry here. And so that started to just, sort of push pressure on the industry here in New Zealand. And at that point, once we started losing staff and we started sort of seeing these offers of rebates that were really pretty close by, a lot of companies here in New Zealand started to feel pressure to consider moving their businesses outside of New Zealand because of the lack of support for the industry.
Did you have a few staff poached yourself?
Yeah, we did lose some staff who ended up working for Australian companies, and a lot of people in our industry were seeing that. It was already pretty challenging to keep senior talent in New Zealand already, and we were kind of just about doing that. And then with the increased pressure from Australia, it became really, really hard. And it wasn't just increased pressure, there was very proactive recruitment of New Zealand staff happening from Australia. It doesn't just affect games, it actually affects our whole technology industry because the skills are so applicable across multiple different industries that you're not just losing a games programmer or a games UI artist. You're actually losing people that will go on to work in multiple different industries across New Zealand.
But yeah, how much did revenue kind of fall, do you know, in the last few years when this rebate was, say, in Australia, but there wasn't really anything here?
Yeah, so in 2023, I believe that revenue growth was just 7% here in Aotearoa compared to 2022, where I believe it was 47%.
Wow, that's
so
quite
it's
a
a pretty big slowdown.
So we saw what was happening in Australia. There was a bit of a lobby to the previous administration. So we're talking, Labour New Zealand first and then Labour again, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. And we just looked over the pond. We saw what was happening. There was lobby from the industry here because we were starting to see people start moving across the Tasman, and we were starting to see a bit of a cap on the kind of growth that we could have with our industry. And there was a really concerted effort to lobby government over the last few years. And obviously every industry is always going to do that, and every industry is going to catastrophize and say, if you don't give us money now, everything's going to collapse. But I do think they really did have a legitimate point when you say if someone across the Tasman is offering a 40% back on the dollar, we just literally cannot compete with that. So something kind of had to be done.
So this was announced by the Labour government in 2023, so last year, was that right?
Yes. So that was part of the final budget, and then we did a bit of reporting earlier in this year. National had been made positive noises about it, but hadn't really said anything certain. And then I had an interview with Judith Collins in January, and then she spoke quite openly about how they were going to be continuing it.
The Finance Minister, the Prime Minister and myself have all said we support this sector.
So that's a commitment for at least this term.
Well, I think what it is, it's a commitment that you've got a lot of support at the very top of the government.
So do you get to play many video games yourself, Minister?
Not so much myself, but my son does. And I do find that it's one where I look at it and I can see why people love it.
It's still in a trial. This is the first of the recipients that have been announced in the past 7 days, and they are going to reassess in the next couple of years to see if it's actually getting the return on investment they want. So it's not something that's locked in for the next decade, but you kind of wouldn't expect that. With the 4 years of funding they've announced, I think that comes to about 160 million. 12 million's going out the door now.
So what's our rebate going to be looking like?
20%. So 20%, which is roughly half, which is half depending on what state, because it can be higher in Australia, up to about 45. And I think 20% is a fair number. Obviously, we don't have the kind of bottomless pockets that Australia does, and we can't just throw more money at it. But I think 20% will be enough to sort of stem any bleeding of people going across there.
How is it supposed to work, the rebate as such?
You have to have a minimum annual expenditure of $250,000, and then it's capped at around 3 million, I believe. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the only thing that doesn't capture is those sort of smaller studios. Like even if you $250,000, at a big scale doesn't sound like much if you're a major developer, but if you're a really small scale developer, you might not be able to spend that money.
And what can you get a rebate on exactly?
What's your expenditure on producing the game? So it's whatever you are spending that you can show was directly into game development staff. That's what you can get the rebate on.
It will cover the obvious things. So, you might instantly think, well, costs of programmers or artists, but it also actually covers some of the other key costs that are involved in game development that people don't often think of, like publishing. So other roles that are also involved in making games, but that aren't necessarily the sort of things you'd think of straight away, which is really fantastic because compared to Australia, we actually have a slightly lower rebate amount, but it's different costs that are covered here in Aotearoa, which has been, from our experience of going through the application process, it's been really fantastic to see those costs recognised and covered.
Give me an example. So, just say someone has a salary of, let's say $100,000.
Yeah, so you have 20% back. So you have to obviously show that person is working in Aotearoa on game development, and then you can claim back 20% of that salary. So that is, really significant.
Well, in that case, where would you be without this rebate? If you didn't have it, what impact would that have?
Where would be sort of without it is, more staff overseas, and also I think would be losing some of our companies overseas, and of course that has impacts in terms of revenue coming back into New Zealand if we were losing companies overseas because of the rebates offered there and the attractiveness of that, and also losing IP to overseas and our creative people. It's pretty lose-lose. So it's been, I think, a really positive step to bring this in.
So you're just losing IP, you mean like intellectual property, do you?
Yes, yeah. If you have a game that does really well, there's a lot of future content that can come from that as well, a lot of future possibilities. And if we're kind of losing our companies overseas, then none of that is going to come back to New Zealand, even if the original creators, wanted to be here. It's not just about the right now, it's about the future as well, and where some of these businesses and some of these teams will go in time.
It's just been announced who the recipients will be, right? So it was the funding announcement in 2023, and we've just heard who the recipients are going to be, right? So did they have to apply for that in that year? Or?
So they were applying for it last year. I imagine that they would have found out, obviously, quite well before we did, because you'd have to start making some plans around whether or not you knew you had that kind of financial security. Some of the ones that stuck out to me were Deep Field Games, who just released a game called Abiotic Factor.
Okay, bit of a kerfuffle downstairs this morning. You probably want to get a move on.
They're a great example of a studio that are doing amazing stuff. Again, pretty small team, but they've produced a game that's one of the biggest selling games in the world right now. It was in the top 5 selling games on Steam, which for anyone who's not familiar is essentially kind of like the iTunes equivalent for games. It's the platform in the world that you go to buy games on if you're on computer. Mm-hmm. They were one of the biggest selling games in the world at launch, and the game's not even finished. They released it in early access, it's called, where it's basically like playing a demo of the game, and they're completely over the moon. They've made an enormous return on investment straight out the gate. So I think they've picked some great studios for this funding, and I think the return on investment's going to be pretty big.
Right, so now we're sitting here, we've got this rebate, there's numerous studios that are going to get money from this, 160 million, you've laid that all out. But, I mean, if it's so profitable, right, why do we need money from the government? Can't we just leave it to the market?
I do understand that argument. I think the two things that I'd say, it's good to have some parity if we are going to be supporting the film industry in the same way, particularly if we want this export-led recovery that we keep talking about, right? The difference with games is you've got this giant international market. So 96% of the profits can come from the international market instead of trying to sell it internally. And there are benefits to that, right? And so there's a much more dependable global market for these games. And if we want to have an export-led recovery, that is their strength. I think the film sector and sometimes struggles with that because we might give the money to the local sector to produce these titles, but they might struggle on the world stage. But some of these games that we're producing, like Dredge, like Abiotic Factor, are immediately being picked up enormously on the global stage. So I think that's one point. Second point would be, yes, it is doing well and it's doing fine. And if we took away this funding, it would probably be okay and keep chugging along, but it's more, if we want to look at the Finland example, well, how big do we want it to be? Where do we want to grow our economy? Are we trying to pivot our economy towards clean, green exports? Well, this seems like an easy win, and if we've spent $1 billion subsidising film between 2010 and 2020, it seems like a fairly solid argument that for a fraction of that, we could actually have games produced here that would have a much better return. There's the intellectual property argument as well. When we're subsidising film, we often don't own the intellectual property rights to the things that we're creating. I think Amazon and Lord of the Rings was the big example for that, right? We gave hundreds of millions of dollars to Amazon to film one season of Lord of the Rings here, and then they just left and took the money and ran, essentially. We don't own the intellectual property rights to Lord of the Rings, but if we produce games here, and those stories start getting picked up across different mediums, we own those intellectual property rights. And that's already happening. Gaming is sort of the next frontier for Hollywood. You're starting to see that happen now. As the MCU kind of fades in relevance, Hollywood's scrambling to try and find what's the next cultural vein to mine that we can produce all these adaptations of that will have a built-in audience already.
And MCU, we're talking the Marvel
Cinematic Universe. Sorry, I don't want to use too much jargon. Yeah, but as comic books and superhero movies are fading in relevance, Hollywood's betting huge on video games. I think there's about 74 adaptations underway now. Dredge Bridge from Christchurch has been bought as a film adaptation. You saw the Super Mario movie, been one of the most profitable movies in the last couple of years. The Last of Us adaptation on HBO was enormous. Fallout, one of the biggest series on Amazon, that's also based on a video game. So there's a gold rush happening right now to try and buy up all these games and produce TV and film out of them. So again, if we own all that intellectual property, the next sort of Middle Earth level equivalent could be a game, and it could be owned by us here.
The market can just continue, and like you say, some things will succeed and some things won't. I think a big motivation behind schemes like this is that the research from overseas shows that countries can see like $2 to $4 return on each dollar invested into this industry. It's kind of just a case of, right, we've got this industry with a huge amount of potential. Do we want to help that along so it can grow bigger and faster and better? Or do we just kind of leave it to do its own thing? And yes, you can leave it to do its own thing, but you're not going to see the same kind of result as quickly. And so, if you look at the research from overseas, it's consistently showing that if you put money into this industry, it will deliver a return that will, bring substantial revenue and substantial tax income back into New Zealand.
But has anyone ever said to you, you're just kind of getting government handouts, I guess, and you should try and make it on your own?
Not to me personally, but, I would say, well, sure, that's what we've been doing. And we've, as an industry, we've been growing really well. We now have come up against a challenge and we've seen the results of that. Growth has really slowed. We now have the opportunity to try to accelerate that growth again. I guess it's just a case of, like any investment, do you think that it will pay off? And the research shows that it will.
The global game industry is really facing a lot of problems right now, which we've so far been sheltered from, but I do expect those headwinds to hit us. I mean, last year there were about 10,000 layoffs in the gaming sector globally, and I think we've already beaten that number this year alone. The industry itself is really going through some challenging times economically. So I imagine while New Zealand's industry is right now thriving, I think it will get hit by that maybe over the next 12 months or so, but the gaming rebate will be a bit of a shield and a bit of a cushion for that. I think it's important to not, sit there and be like, oh, we're just sort of shilling for an industry. It seems like there's money on the table. There are obvious benefits to it. And the other thing I'd say is I think video games are just the most interesting way to tell stories. And I just think they're an incredible thing to support because of that. They're the only media in the world that are the combination of every other art form that we have, because it's writing, it's music, it's sound design, it's cinematography, it's everything put together, but with this extra element of the player actually actively participating and controlling it. I think that makes it a much more incredible and interesting art form than so many others. I mean, there's an old joke about that. It's like, imagine if you were reading Great Expectations and then halfway through it just snapped shut and was like, what are the major themes of the book? If you can't answer, you don't get to finish it. Gaming's like that. You actually have to be good at it to experience the entire thing. And I always found that fascinating.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. Today's episode was engineered by Alex Harmer. Gwen McClure, Alexia Russell and Davina Zimmer are our producers. Thanks to Finn Hogan and Zoe Hobson. I'm Tom Kitchen.